Somewhere in the Bavarian Alps, at 4 in the morning on June 6, 1944, a German officer stood outside a bedroom door and did nothing. He held a report that would decide the outcome of the Second World War. Behind that door, the one man who could stop the largest invasion in human history was asleep. On the coast of Normandy, 5,000 ships were closing in. 11,000 aircraft filled the sky. 2 panzer divisions sat fueled and ready, less than 100 miles away, capable of throwing the entire invasion back into the sea within hours. All they needed was one signature. The officer raised his hand to knock, and stopped. What happened in the next 6 hours has been told wrong for 80 years. Because the real reason no one woke Hitler that morning had almost nothing to do with fear. To understand why one closed door mattered so much, you have to understand what Germany had spent 4 years building to make sure this exact moment never happened. By the spring of 1944, Adolf Hitler knew the invasion was coming. He didn't know the day, he didn't know the beach, but he knew that somewhere along 2,000 miles of French coastline, Allied forces were preparing to attempt the largest amphibious assault in human history. And he knew that if it succeeded, Germany would be fighting a two-front war it could not win. The Eastern Front was already bleeding the Wehrmacht dry, with over 2 million German soldiers committed against a Soviet army whose momentum nothing seemed able to stop. If the Allies opened a second front in France, Germany would be caught between 2 grinding, unstoppable machines, forced to fight in both directions at once, with dwindling fuel, dwindling manpower, and a homeland already being reduced to rubble by Allied bombers every night. Berlin understood this with total clarity. The Atlantic Wall wasn't just a defensive project. It was the last barrier separating a two-front catastrophe from a war Germany might still, theoretically, fight to a stalemate. So Germany built concrete bunkers stretched along the French coast for hundreds of miles, some with walls over 6 feet thick, capable of absorbing direct hits from naval guns. Beach obstacles, over 4 million of them by some estimates, littered the sand and the shallows, iron hedgehogs and wooden stakes topped with mines, designed to shred landing craft and drown soldiers before they ever reach dry land. Minefields stretched inland in dense belts, some containing more than 500,000 mines along a single stretch of coastline. Machine gun nests were positioned with overlapping fields of fire so precise that German commanders had calculated exactly how many rounds could be poured into a single 100-yard stretch of beach every 60 seconds. But concrete and mines were never the real weapon. The real weapon, the one every German commander from the coast to Berlin agreed on, was armor. Panzer divisions, tanks. Because everyone understood a brutal truth about amphibious warfare. The invaders are never weaker than in the first few hours after they land. Soaked, disorganized, cut off from heavy artillery, still sitting offshore, pinned against a beach with the sea at their backs, an invading force is at its most fragile the moment its boots hit the sand. If German tanks could reach the beaches within those first critical hours, while the Allies were still tangled in their own landing craft and half-formed defensive lines, the invasion could be crushed, not slowed, crushed. Thrown back into the channel before it ever became a beachhead, before it could ever be resupplied, before the story of D-Day could even properly begin. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the man tasked with defending this coastline, believed this more fiercely than almost anyone in the German high command. He had fought the Allies across the deserts of North Africa. He had watched Allied air power dominate open ground, watched entire columns of tanks get torn apart from the sky before they ever reached a battle. He knew that if German armor had to travel far to reach the invasion beaches, Allied fighter bombers would find them strung out on open roads in broad daylight and destroy them before they arrived. His conclusion was as simple as it was urgent. The panzers needed to be stationed close to the coast, under local command, ready to counterattack within the first hour of any landing. Waiting even half a day, he warned anyone who would listen, could be fatal to the entire defense of France. But Rommel did not have the final word. Command of Germany's most powerful reserve tank divisions, including 2 positioned dangerously close to the coast of Normandy, had been placed under a different authority entirely. Not the regional commanders, not Rommel, not even the overall commander-in-chief of German forces in the West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. A special category of reserve, the WWII Panzer Reserve, could only be released by direct order from one man alone, Adolf Hitler. Every German general who understood modern warfare knew this arrangement was dangerous. It meant that in the exact moment when speed would matter more than anything else in the war, the decision to unleash Germany's most powerful counterstrike force would depend not on the commander standing closest to the beaches, not on tactical judgment made in real time under fire, but on Hitler personally being awake, informed, and willing to give the order without hesitation. Nobody in the German high command wanted to test what would happen if that chain broke. They were about to find out, on a single night, in a single house, with the fate of the entire Western Front hanging on whether anyone had the nerve to knock on a door. The plan, on paper, was airtight. 2 panzer divisions, the 12th SS Hitlerjugend and Panzer Lehr, sat in reserve behind the Normandy coast, close enough to reach any invasion beach within a matter of hours if released immediately. Together they represented roughly 400 tanks and tens of thousands of trained soldiers, some of the most heavily armed and mechanized units left in the German army by 1944. Their orders were explicit and non-negotiable. No regional commander, not Rommel, not von Rundstedt, could deploy them without direct authorization from Hitler's own headquarters. It was designed as a safeguard, a way to ensure Germany's most valuable armored reserve wasn't wasted responding to a diversion, while the real invasion landed somewhere else entirely. Hitler had grown personally convinced that the Allies might strike at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, and the most obvious place to cross. He wanted the power to hold his reserves back until he was certain, rather than let regional commanders commit them prematurely to what might turn out to be a feint. It was a plan built entirely on centralized control. And control, in this case, required one single non-negotiable condition: Hitler being reachable, awake, and decisive the moment the real invasion began. On paper, that condition sounded reasonable enough, even prudent, a way to prevent panic-driven overreactions to the kind of scattered decoy landings the Allies had staged elsewhere earlier in the war. In practice, it meant that the fate of the entire Atlantic Wall, 4 years and untold billions of Reichsmarks of concrete, steel, and manpower, now rested on the assumption that one man, in one specific location, would always be available exactly when needed. No contingency existed for the possibility that he simply wouldn't be. By the early hours of June 6th, that safeguard had already become a trap. Allied paratroopers, more than 13,000 of them from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions alone, were dropping behind Utah and Omaha beaches by 1 a.m., hours before the first landing craft would even touch sand. Radio reports of German units engaging unidentified airborne troops in the darkness began reaching field command posts almost immediately, garbled, contradictory, and terrifying in their uncertainty. By 3 a.m., it was clear to officers on the ground that something enormous was underway, something far larger than a raid or a diversion. Yet at Hitler's headquarters in Berchtesgaden, nearly 600 miles from the beaches, no one moved to wake him. His staff operated under strict, long-standing instructions never to disturb his sleep, a habit reinforced by years of late-night strategy sessions, and a documented, almost obsessive insomnia that kept him awake analyzing maps until dawn most nights, and unconscious well into the following morning. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff, and one of the few men with any real authority to act, received the reports of the airborne landings and made a fateful judgment call entirely on his own. He believed, as Hitler did, that this could still be an elaborate diversion, a feint meant to draw German reserves away from the real invasion still to come at Calais. Without Hitler's personal authorization, he refused to release the Panzer Reserve. Every hour that passed without a decision was an hour the Allies used to widen their beachhead, to push men and equipment further inland, to turn a fragile toehold into something far harder to dislodge. The 2 divisions capable of crushing the invasion in its cradle sat exactly where they had the night before. Engines cold, waiting on a phone call that never came. Junior officers who understood exactly what was unfolding began pressing their commanders for permission to move anyway, arguing that waiting any longer would hand the Allies the one thing they desperately needed: time to dig in. Some field commanders quietly began preparing their units to move the moment authorization arrived, fueling trucks, briefing crews, plotting routes toward the coast on maps spread across the hoods of staff cars, doing everything short of actually crossing the line into unauthorized deployment. But without that single signature from Hitler's headquarters, none of it mattered. The machinery of the German army, famous across the world for its speed and precision, had been reduced to men standing beside idling tanks, watching the clock, waiting for a phone that refused to ring. At roughly 4 a.m., an officer finally arrived outside Hitler's private quarters, carrying updated reports that made clear this was no longer a possible diversion, but a full-scale invasion along dozens of miles of Norman coastline. And there, the entire chain of command stalled completely, frozen by a culture of fear built up over years. Accounts from surviving staff describe an atmosphere around Hitler's rest so tightly controlled that no one, not a general, not a senior aide, dared knock on that door uninvited. He had reportedly flown into furious rages before over being disturbed with anything less than fully confirmed intelligence, and by 1944, his mood swings had grown volatile and unpredictable enough that even his most senior commanders went out of their way to avoid provoking him unnecessarily. So the officer waited outside the door, and waited. Hitler did not wake until somewhere between 9 and 10 a.m. by most accounts, with some historians suggesting it may have stretched even closer to noon, nearly 6 to 10 hours after the first Allied boots had already touched Norman soil. When he was finally briefed, he still hesitated, still voiced suspicion that this might be an elaborate feint, still wanted further confirmation before committing what he considered his last truly reliable strategic reserve in the West. The formal order to release the Panzer divisions wasn't issued until early afternoon, roughly 12 hours after the first paratroopers had landed. By then, the two divisions that could have driven straight into the beaches within the first fragile hours, instead, found themselves advancing into a battlefield already thick with Allied infantry, naval gunfire from offshore battleships, firing shells the size of small cars, and total Allied air superiority overhead that turned every open road into a shooting gallery. Tanks that should have been counterattacking a half-formed beachhead at sunrise were instead crawling toward a fully consolidated Allied position in the middle of the afternoon, harassed the entire way by fighter bombers that had spent the morning with almost nothing else to hunt. The window had not simply closed, it had been bricked over, sealed by silence in a hallway 600 miles from the fighting. Some historians have since calculated that even a 2 or 3 hour head start might have let the 12th SS reach the coast road network before Allied fighter bombers fully dominated the daylight sky, giving the Panzers at least a fighting chance of reaching the beaches intact instead of being caught strung out and exposed on open roads in broad afternoon light, which is precisely what happened instead. Instead of striking a beachhead still measured in a few hundred yards of sand, the divisions that finally moved that afternoon were driving toward a front that had already grown miles deep, defended by dug-in infantry, forward artillery observers calling in naval fire with pinpoint accuracy, and swarms of Allied aircraft that treated any column of German armor on an open road as an easy, almost leisurely target. For the men actually standing in the surf that morning, none of this bureaucratic paralysis was visible. All they knew was that the counterattack they feared most, the wave of German steel that Rommel had warned would arrive within the first hour, simply never came. American soldiers pinned down on Omaha Beach, taking devastating casualties from machine gun positions dug into the bluffs above, with some companies losing more than 60% of their men in the first half hour alone, kept scanning the ridgeline for German tanks that never appeared. Canadian troops pushing inland from Juno Beach braced for armor that stayed frozen in reserve, 60, 70, 80 miles away, engines idling, radios silent, waiting on a piece of paper that hadn't been signed yet. On the German side, the men manning the coastal defenses were often not the hardened veterans of propaganda, but exhausted soldiers pulled from the Eastern Front to recover, teenagers barely out of training, and conscripts from occupied territories with little loyalty to the cause they were dying for. They fought bunker by isolated bunker, radioing desperately for the armored reinforcements Rommel had promised would come fast, and many never received an answer at all. Rommel himself wasn't even in France that day. Convinced the rough Channel weather made any invasion attempt unlikely for at least another week, he had traveled home to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday, and it took hours for anyone to reach him by phone and confirm that the invasion he had feared and prepared for over the past year was actually, finally, underway. By the time he raced back toward his headquarters, through roads already being strafed by Allied fighters, the decision that might have changed everything had already slipped past the point where it could still matter. For every hour Hitler slept, more Allied soldiers dug foxholes into French sand. More landing craft unloaded tanks and artillery onto the beaches. More of the fragile toehold solidified into something no counterattack, however fast, could have easily erased. By nightfall on June 6th, an estimated 156,000 Allied troops had come ashore, at a cost of more than 10,000 casualties across the 5 landing beaches. At Omaha alone, the toll ran close to 2,000 men killed, wounded, or missing in a single day. A stretch of sand barely 6 miles long that became one of the deadliest pieces of ground in the entire war. Wounded men lay in the tide line for hours because medics couldn't reach them through the machine gun fire raking the beach. Landing craft that took direct hits sent soldiers into the water, carrying 80 pounds of equipment, and many drowned within sight of the shore before they ever fired a shot. Officers died in the first minutes of the assault, at a rate that left entire companies leaderless. Sergeants and even privates forced to organize the survivors and push forward, because there was no one left above them to give the order. And on the German side of the line, the men in those bunkers were fighting a battle they had been trained to believe would last an hour, not a day. Ammunition ran low by mid-afternoon in several strong points. Communication lines to the rear, cut by naval bombardment and sabotage, went silent one by one, leaving isolated pockets of German soldiers to keep firing on their own judgment, with no idea whether reinforcements were an hour away or never coming at all. Some surrendered by evening, exhausted and out of ammunition, staring at a coastline covered end to end with an invasion force they had been told, for months, would never be allowed to survive the first hour on the sand. Every single one of them, on both sides of that line, was fighting inside a gap created 600 miles away, in a quiet hallway, by a decision nobody had the authority or the courage to make. The human price of that stillness was measured in bodies on both sides, in a battle that should have been decided by dawn, instead grinding on for the entire day, and in a German command structure that discovered, far too late, that the most powerful army in Europe is worthless if no one is willing to give the order to move it. If you're enjoying how this is unfolding, subscribe, because this is the kind of history we cover every week. Stories where one closed door, one overlooked order, one ordinary human habit, ends up deciding the outcome of the largest military operation ever attempted. And the story of what actually happened behind that door is about to get a lot stranger. Here is the detail almost every account of D-Day leaves out. It was never really about a general who was too scared to knock. For decades, the story of Hitler sleeping through the most consequential morning of the war has been told as a simple failure of nerve. A room full of terrified subordinates, too afraid of one man's temper to interrupt his rest, even with an invasion underway. It's a clean story. It fits the image of Hitler as a volatile tyrant, whose staff tiptoed around him like a landmine waiting to go off. But the deeper you look into what actually happened in Berchtesgaden that night, the less it looks like simple cowardice, and the more it looks like something Hitler had built into his own command structure on purpose, years earlier, and then became trapped inside of, on the one morning it mattered most. Hitler's sleep schedule wasn't an accident of personality. It was a deliberate, almost ritualized habit, dating back years before the invasion, tied to his conviction that his mind worked best in the deep hours of the night, when he would hold rambling strategy sessions with aides and generals that regularly stretched past 2 o'clock or 3 a.m. He genuinely believed his instincts about the war, about where the Allies would strike, about the true meaning behind any given field report, were sharper and more reliable than the formal analysis of his own general staff. This wasn't a minor personality quirk to be worked around. It had become, functionally, doctrine inside his headquarters. Officers around him had learned, through repeated and often painful experience, that waking him early with incomplete or unconfirmed information didn't just risk his temper. It risked something worse, him making a snap decision based on partial data, overriding weeks of careful defensive planning with a single impulsive judgment call, because he trusted his own gut over his general's analysis, especially in the fog of the middle of the night, when both his certainty and his temper ran hottest. So the paralysis outside that door on June 6th wasn't only fear of disturbing his rest, it was a system that had spent years training an entire command staff to believe that waking Hitler with uncertain, unconfirmed information was more dangerous, professionally and personally, than letting a report wait a few more hours until it could be delivered with total, undeniable clarity. And on the morning of the invasion, the information genuinely was uncertain, at least at first. Airborne landings had been used before in the war as decoys and diversions to draw attention away from a main assault elsewhere. Hitler and Jodel's shared conviction that Normandy might be an elaborate feint for a larger, more dangerous attack at Calais wasn't paranoid fantasy conjured out of nowhere. It was the product of one of the most successful deception operations in the history of warfare, an Allied intelligence campaign that had spent the better part of a year feeding German intelligence fabricated evidence of an entire phantom army group preparing to strike at Calais, complete with fake radio traffic designed to be intercepted, inflatable rubber tanks positioned to be photographed from the air, and a real, decorated American general publicly assigned to command a force that didn't actually exist. That deception campaign worked so completely that even weeks after the real invasion at Normandy was well underway and clearly the main event, Hitler kept significant armored forces held in reserve near Calais, still convinced the landings he had already lost the Panzer window over might yet turn out to be the diversion after all. Which means the secret sitting at the heart of this story isn't simply that one man overslept on the worst possible morning. It's that Germany's entire command structure, built around funneling every critical wartime decision through a single individual whose judgment his own staff had learned, through fear, never to challenge, collided on one single night with one of the most successful deception campaigns ever executed, and the two failures amplified each other into something genuinely catastrophic. Hitler wasn't simply asleep by unlucky accident. He was asleep inside a system he had personally built to insulate himself from ever being caught wrong. A system where information had to be perfect and beyond dispute before anyone dared bring it to him, and where his own staff had learned that the safest possible option, in any moment of doubt, was always to wait rather than risk his fury over an incomplete picture. On the one single morning in the entire war, when speed mattered more than certainty, that system did exactly what it had been quietly designed to do for years. It protected Hitler from being disturbed. And in protecting him, it disarmed the single fastest, most powerful counterattack Germany had left in the West to throw the entire invasion back into the sea. The mistake, in the end, wasn't that Hitler slept in on the morning of June 6th. The mistake was building a command structure so centralized, so entirely dependent on one man's approval and one man's mood, that an entire army group, hundreds of tanks and tens of thousands of soldiers, could be paralyzed by nothing more than a closed bedroom door and a staff too conditioned by years of fear to open it. And what makes it sting even more, in hindsight, is that Hitler didn't need to be woken with a perfect, fully confirmed picture of the invasion to make the right call. He simply needed someone willing to hand him an imperfect one and accept the consequences of being wrong. Nobody was. Years of watching him erupt over incomplete reports had trained an entire headquarters to choose silence over risk, certainty over speed, and on the one morning where speed was the only thing that could have saved the defense of France, that training became the most costly habit in the history of the Wehrmacht. By the time the Panzer divisions finally moved that afternoon, the beachhead at Normandy was no longer the fragile, contested strip of sand it had been at dawn. It had become something close to permanent, and from that foothold the Allies pushed inland for the next 11 months, until Germany surrendered entirely in May of 1945. Historians still debate exactly how much those lost hours mattered in the grand arithmetic of the war. Weighed against Allied air supremacy, naval firepower, and the sheer scale of the forces committed that day, But few seriously dispute that they mattered enormously, because in an invasion that was won or lost by margins measured in minutes and yards of sand, 6 to 10 hours of paralysis at the very top of the German command was not a minor administrative delay. It was, quite plausibly, one of the most expensive naps in the history of warfare, a silence that echoed all the way from a locked bedroom in the Bavarian Alps to a beach 600 miles away, where men were dying waiting for tanks that would never arrive in time. What makes this story worth telling, in the end, isn't really about tanks or beaches, or even about Hitler himself as a man. It's about what happens when an entire organization becomes so afraid of one person's reaction that it quietly stops functioning the moment that person is unavailable. Rommel had begged, repeatedly and on the record, for local commanders to be given the authority to move those divisions without waiting on approval from Berlin. He had warned, explicitly, that the first 24 hours of any invasion would decide the entire campaign, that the panzers had to counterattack immediately or not at all. He turned out to be exactly right, and the very system built above him, the one he had no power to override, made absolutely sure his warning arrived too late to matter. The mistake that changed D-Day wasn't really a battlefield error made under fire. It was a structural one, quietly built years before the invasion ever began, sitting dormant and unnoticed until the one single morning when it would matter more than anything else in the war. It is worth remembering, too, that the men who paid for that mistake never knew it had even been made. The soldiers waiting for tanks on Omaha Beach didn't know a signature was missing 600 miles away. The Germans holding isolated bunkers with dwindling ammunition didn't know their reinforcements were parked and fueled, waiting on a phone call. History rarely announces its turning points at the moment they happen. Most of the time, they look exactly like nothing at all. A closed door, a quiet hallway, a staff officer glancing at a clock and deciding, one more time, to wait just a little longer. It's a strange, almost uncomfortable thought that the largest, most meticulously planned invasion in human history may have hinged less on strategy, or steel, or numbers, and more on whether a handful of exhausted men were brave enough to risk a bad night's sleep for their commander. So the next time you hear that Hitler simply overslept through D-Day, remember that it was never really about sleep at all. It was about a command structure so brittle, so dependent on the mood of a single man behind a single closed door, that an entire army could be held motionless by nothing more than silence in a hallway. Somewhere in Berchtesgaden, in the stillness of a locked room while the war outside quietly slipped away, the outcome of the Second World War tipped just slightly, permanently, and irreversibly. And no one inside that house even knew it was happening until it was already far too late to matter. It's tempting, looking back from decades away, to imagine the officer outside that door finally working up the courage to knock. To picture an alternate morning where the panzers rolled at dawn instead of dusk. But that's exactly the point this story keeps circling back to. The system wasn't built to allow for that kind of courage. It was built, deliberately and methodically, to remove it, one fearful staff meeting at a time, until the machine simply stopped when its one operator went to sleep. If you want to see what happened when the Allies nearly lost their own foothold days later, at a place historians now call Omaha Beach's forgotten twin battle, there's a video linked on screen right now that picks up exactly where this one leaves off.